My name is Daniel. I work with Outreach at CEMUS, the Center for Environment and Development Studies here at Uppsala University in SLU. Great to see so many here, and we also have people on Zoom, and we're also recording this, if that's okay with everybody. But if you ask a question, your voice might be slightly heard in the background, but you're used to that by now. The final thing, I'm going to thank also Nicola and Salman for organizing this. This lecture is also part of the Climate Change Leadership course, spring course that we have at CEMUS. And the final thing I'm going to say is that we have a ton of other events happening in March, but also specifically this week. So you can continue this afternoon at 2:15 with two guests from Colombia. Oops, there's a book release tomorrow at 4:30. There's a lecture at 6 in Swedish on Wednesday, and much more. So you can see that up here in the break as well. And great to have Kevin Anderson back here in Uppsala, and also in person, being in an actual room with actual human beings. Remember that. And hopefully we can get or see better days for the world and Europe in a bigger, larger context as well, with everything happening in Ukraine. They're in a very different situation. And also a reminder that the air siren testing system will go off at 3 o'clock this afternoon here in Uppsala and in Sweden. So don't get scared by that. So it's 3 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good. Right. Well, it's fantastic to be back. And actually, what's quite interesting is quite a few familiar faces here from many, many moons ago. But they were a little bit older, actually, having said that. So, yeah, it's wonderful to be back in Uppsala. Yeah, I've really missed it. I've not been here for 2 years, so it feels even longer than that actually. So on today's talk, those of you that I recognise here will have seen quite a few of these things before, because not that much has changed. And I've been told there's a break partway through, so I'm going to be sort of going through the issues as I see them around climate change, with a focus on Sweden. And I know some of you on the course and that I'm not necessarily from Sweden, but I'm focusing in on Sweden. I'm not picking on Sweden, but because I'm here, I can do the same talk, very similar talk in Norway last week or in the UK. So I mean, the same sort of language and criticisms I'm going to be making here can be made of any wealthy country, pretty much. There are no good countries when it comes to climate change, but I think you're probably all well aware of that anyway. Is there any way to move this, Daniel? This bit here, or not? Doesn't matter. It probably doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So I'm going to start off with a slide I've quite often used, and it's just this, just evoking the spirit of sort of JFK, and started abusing his statement that it's not what can Sweden do to reduce its emissions. And I hear this everywhere. You know, what can we do? I don't care what you can do. It's what have you signed up to? So that, you know, what we want to know is what are the total emission reductions Paris that Sweden is required to deliver to meet the Paris commitments that it's signed up to. So, and there's a difference between those two. The first one is always influenced by what can we do without changing business as usual. And the second one says, well, what do we actually need to do to deliver on our commitments? And you hear this whether it's in companies or whether it's in countries. They always prefer the first and almost always ignore the second. And the UK is a really good example of that, actually. I'm then going to start by thinking about two recent emergencies that we've had. I say recent because some of you probably won't remember this one very well, but for me it was just a few years ago. But for a few of you, you probably were probably still at school at the time. But the banking crisis, which was about 2007 and 8, 9 really, and arguably ran on for about almost a decade afterwards. But if you went back to 2006, 2007, and said you wanted rapid social change, people would say, well, it's impossible. You'll never get it. The public won't accept it. And yet in 2007, we had the subprime mortgage scandal in the US that's quickly spread around pretty much most of the Western world, and indeed affected many of the global communities in the global South as well, the banking communities. So the subprime mortgage scandal, we had following on from that, a decade of austerity policies where governments fundamentally changed how they ran their economics. So when we hear this argument, we can't change our economics, we changed our economics almost overnight and fundamentally changed it. In my view, not for the better, but we could have changed it for the better. That was a choice that we made. So we had a huge shift in how governments operated, a big move away from the idea of sort of being driven, at least ostensibly, by markets. So move away from that. Huge cuts in public services, in job security, massive social upheaval as a consequence, particularly amongst poor communities. and this thing called quantitative easing, where governments, banks just printed huge quantities of money and dumped it into the system. Effectively, what that does, it takes public money and converts it into the private sector, and then the private sector spends it, which is supposed to make your economy more buoyant again. And it's supposed to lead to inflation, which we didn't actually get, but we're getting it now, so maybe it's just a delay. So what we went from was the impossible to the actual delivered in just a handful of years. We actually managed to do exactly what we said was impossible just a few years before. If we then move on from that crisis to one that probably you're all a bit more familiar with, the absolute tragedy that was and still is for many parts of the world, is COVID. Again, we've got the same sort of language, particularly to work on climate change, or we can't have rapid social change. It's just impossible. Yeah, overnight we had it here. We had COVID, and this is probably certainly in my life, I think it's probably the most disruptive that we've actually seen, one way or another, both in terms of the virus itself and also, of course, in terms of how we responded to it in various ways. But we had lockdowns, rapid mobilization of research, all the treatments and vaccines, all these things that were reminiscent of how we respond to wars. So it was really very similar to how we do that. We're almost like rationing back in there, that companies quickly got lots of money to try and develop new technologies. It used to be tanks and bomber aircraft, and now at this time it was treatments and vaccines. Again, as with the banking crisis, the people that were most impacted were the poorer communities, whether it's in terms of their jobs, or indeed, in many parts of the world, it was actually because they live in different types of households, multi-generational households, because they often do the jobs that have much greater contact with the public, then they were much more affected. So typically affected poorer people, and certainly in the UK, disproportionately people of colour, significantly disproportionately people of colour. And it wasn't because they were genetically predisposed to it particularly. There's a little bit of difference there, but not really. It was mostly because of the jobs they did in our society. But again, from the impossible to the delivered in 2 years. So we have had emergencies where we responded incredibly rapidly. So what COVID-induced emission reductions, obviously we weren't trying to bring emissions down by having a virus spread around the world, but nevertheless we can witness that. We see that the updated data is about 4 to 5% of global emissions, a drop in carbon dioxide. Now if you carried that on, this I think gives you a sense of the absolute minimum that we need to deliver. Imagine if we did that every single year. That means you can't just do the same as you did in the COVID year. You have to do it again, slightly deeper, and slightly deeper again, and slightly deeper again. But if you did that, that sort of level of cut, year on year on year, would give us something like an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade at a global level. But I think that gives us some sort of sense of the scale of the challenge that we're actually facing. Can you imagine applying this sort of draconian legislation that we saw when it came to COVID year after year? But I'm not saying that's how we should respond to climate change, but it gives you a feel of the sort of disruption to our society that's going to be required if we are to respond and deliver on the temperatures that we've committed to. But of course, those temperatures themselves, if we don't do this, then the impacts will be much greater than the response. But the signs are not good in terms of how we've bounced back, if it depends how you want to look at it, post-COVID. The poorest and the wealthiest communities are again seeking economic growth, the panacea to all problems, it would appear. More energy, more resources. With this language of decoupling, which if you work on climate change, you often hear the decoupling of growth from emissions. It's a myth, just a myth. You can look at it, if you draw narrow enough boundaries, you can say, oh, look, the UK is decoupled. What we mean is we've offshored our high emission sectors to poor parts of the world. As soon as you step back from it, you see virtually no decoupling. The small elements you might see, anyway, are nowhere near the scale of decoupling we require. But economists love this language because it allows them to carry on spouting the same nonsense. And economic growth is to be welcomed. I think it's probably behind this thing here, but it says, in the UK, Sweden, and the EU, do we really need economic growth? It's to be welcomed in Ghana, in Rwanda, in some of the poorer communities around the world. We want them to have economic growth. We want them to consume more stuff, material stuff. I want them to use more energy. I want them to have higher carbon dioxide emissions in the short term, but not for the UK, Sweden, the US, the EU, the wealthy parts of the world. We can't have economic growth anymore. We can have it within poorer communities, but not as an aggregate. We shouldn't have been having it for lots of years, really. So we have to rethink this agenda. So let's take this back to climate change again. I'm going to start with just a bit of science. This is probably not necessary here, but I sort of language I use often when I'm talking to companies or to governments, that the climate does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, to eloquent arguments, to legal niceties or accountancy scams. And later on, I'll explain why I think net zero is an accountancy scam. It only responds to one thing, and that's the brutal beauty of the physics. That's what it responds to, how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we dump in the atmosphere. It doesn't care about our good intentions or our policies or our offsetting and all that other stuff. It doesn't care about that. It only cares about the amount of CO2. And I think that's really key to remember that. So whatever we do has to bring the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, has to bring that down. You can't just move it around, which is what we've been trying to do for a long time. So if we go now to the Paris Agreement, which is something I think probably you're all familiar with, because I gather I think most of you in the course of you've had quite a lot of lectures and so forth on climate change. You're all probably quite familiar with all this. But the Paris Agreement, which if you haven't read it, is well worth reading. It's not very long. It's about 32 pages, and in fact, it's quite repetitive. So really, it's about 16 sides to really read. This idea of holding to below 2 degrees centigrade, and to do so in accordance with the best science, broadly captured in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course on the basis of equity. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the IPCC, the natural process and the right process of consensual science, bringing scientists together to get that sort of consensual view, typically means it's always a little bit out of date. So the IPCC reports are always a little bit out of date because they're using data from probably the last 2 years. So the very latest papers probably won't be in there. But that's a natural process that we have to, I think as a user of it, you've got to remind yourself of that. I'm going to focus here today mostly on 1.5 because that's the new framing that seems to have emerged at the same time that our emissions have gone up. It makes it even more difficult to hit 2 degrees centigrade. We've actually now got a tighter target around 1.5. Now, 1.5 in the Paris Agreement was quite a shock. I was involved in Paris in reading some of the and commenting on some of the earlier drafts during the actual negotiations. And then suddenly this 1.5 degree centigrade bit popped in, which was a real shock to many of us. But it was actually about the first time the poorer parts of the world had got together and pushed hard to say they wanted 1.5 in there. Because for them, the impacts, of course, are being felt today. But on the back of that, we didn't know much about 1.5 because it hadn't really been spoken about so much. The IPCC were asked to look at the impacts of 1.5 and the impacts of 2 more generally and sort of say, well, what does this mean? So a few years later, we had the 1.5 report, the SR 1.5, Special Report 1.5 in 2018. And I'm going to summarize the output of that in one sort of sentence, really. The impacts of even 1.5 are severe across ecosystems, human systems, physical infrastructure and agriculture, more floods, more droughts, more fires, more extinctions, more mass migrations of all sorts of species, including humans. So nothing good about 1.5, except for it's not as bad as 2. But it is worth bearing in mind that 1.5 is not a safe threshold. We're seeing the impacts of 1 degree centigrade. It looks now, we can statistically see, it's still on the margins, but statistically see the impacts of 1 degree centigrade of warming playing out around the planet. So we're seeing those impacts, particularly in some of the poor parts of the world, but even in some of the wealthier parts of the world now. And it's exactly as we expect. If you put that much more energy into the atmosphere, you expect to get more activity from it. So physics tells us this is what we should expect, and we're empirically seeing this. But the impacts are almost sort of exponential. They get noticeably worse as the temperature rises. The important part here is just to notice that the difference between 1.5 and 2 is only half a degree. But if you're walking around outside here today, you might quite welcome half a degree of extra warmth, or not if you're a keen skier. But I mean, it's not much of a temperature difference. But actually, the impact at a global level is huge. It is a huge temperature difference, half a degree. So every 0.1 of a degree is worth fighting for, because it has a significant impact on how ecosystems and human systems evolve. And on the back of the IPCC SR 1.5, and I think it's fair to say, and I'll come back to that, I think I'm coming back to that later, sort of the wider discussion in civil society, there's a whole lot of sort of climate emergencies declared all over the place, and similar sort of language used. So Sweden was the first in the Nordic countries. Norway hasn't actually declared a climate emergency, but their foreign minister has actually referred specifically to us being in a climate emergency. But that sort of language is now quite common one way or another. And then following on from this, we had the G7 communique that came out in May of last year, and there the focus was on 1.5 again. I don't think many people involved in this actually had any understanding what that meant in terms of reducing emissions, but they said, well, let's keep to 1.5. And then, of course, we had the Paris Agreement with the sort of strapline of keep 1.5 alive. And this is the UK government's chief scientific advisor, and he was making the point that it's not really negotiable. You know, we now are starting to understand the impacts of 1 degree centigrade looking bad and 1.5 dire. And so we really, it's not a choice to go above 1.5. We've got to stay below that. Well, you get accompanied with music here now. It's quite nice, that. It's soporific compared with the slides. Right, so yeah, the language of 1.5, I think, has been much more locked into the dialogue around climate change at a time when our emissions are not going down. In fact, our emissions are going up. So it's a really strange sort of dilemma. We've got a tighter target, and yet the emissions are still rising, and there's no real policies to stop that at the moment. So if we then interpret the 1.5 in terms of probabilities, which for us as sort of academics trying to look at this stuff and then sort of convert the commitments into, well, what do we have to do about it? You know, what policies do we need? This is quite important. So I'm using 3 here, but I'm going to focus on the 50% chance of 1.5. So the 50% likelihood of 1.5. Now, that's not particularly good. I mean, if you think that something is dire and you've got a 50-50 chance of getting it, it's not a positive, you know, intention really. But it's probably about the best that we can achieve now. I'll briefly look at 67% chance of 1.5. No, there's a much better chance, but I don't think that's any way likely anymore. Well, even possible. And an 83% chance, so a very good chance of staying well below 2 degrees centigrade, which is the language in the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is about well below 2 and pursue 1. But since then, I say the 1.5, pursue 1.5 rather. The 1.5 has been tightened up quite a lot now. So there are the 3 sort of framings I'm looking at. I think it's worth bearing in mind that 1 degree centigrade, just to remind ourselves, is not a safe threshold. When you were sat comfortably in Sweden, which is pretty well geographically insulated, as is the UK indeed, and in most of Northern Europe is, we're sort of insulated from the direct impacts, most of the direct impacts of 1 degree centigrade of warming. But we have to bear in mind, if you look at Mozambique or if you look at Madagascar as well, I mean, been hit again just last week, you look at what's happening there in terms of both the frequency and it looks like the severity of the storms getting worse. And both of those we're sort of expecting that from the models. You know, people are already suffering from climate change, exacerbating other tensions that they've got exacerbating extreme weather events. We're already seeing the impacts on emblematic ecosystems and of course other ones of our own. We know that, well, the IPCC say at 1.5 we're going to destroy pretty much 75% of all tropical corals at 1.5. Think about the Barrier Reef, we will wipe out 75% of it. At 2 degrees centigrade, they say there will be no tropical corals left. So that's that's just one emblematic ecosystem or ecosystems. But this is happening elsewhere in terms of insects that pollinate our crops and things like that as well. So we're aware now, much more than we were before, because a lot of work has gone into this, of the sorts of impacts we're seeing with these temperature rises. And it's not the temperature rises themselves, it's how fast they're happening. If they happened over 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, it wouldn't really matter, but they're happening almost overnight, these temperatures. 100 years, that's nothing for ecosystems. It's nothing for human systems either. We're locked into our human systems that go back many, many generations. And of course, future generations are going to suffer from climate change. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves, and actually I got reminded of this when I was in Glasgow at the last COP, that our current emissions are killing people today and causing destruction and devastation today. And I was sat in a panel of people talking about equity issues, actually, and I referred to climate change as a threat, which is I shouldn't have used that language. And the lady next to me from the Philippines pointed out it's not a threat, it's their reality. They're living through that today. And I think we have to remind ourselves that we're not talking about impacts in 2030 or 2050 or 2070. We're talking about the impacts that are killing people today in poor parts of the world who had nothing to do with the problem, and that we have known about this for 30 years or more. So I think I think almost in all negotiations, we need to have people there in our own countries. When you're trying to decide your laws in Sweden or the UK, we need people there, actually in the meetings, who come from poor parts of the world, who can remind us of the reality of the thing we're talking about. So what's our response to these commitments? What have we seen so far? Well, firstly, my generation, and that includes some of you now as well, some others of you who are looking across, that our generation requires a bit of humility here. As you know, I often point this out, and so do my colleagues here. Since 1990, we've had a over 60% rise now in emissions. And the first IPCC report was 1990. The first big Earth summit was in Rio in 1992. Quite a lot of hope that we'd do something about it. And we've actually emitted more carbon dioxide since 1990 as a species than we emitted before 1990 throughout all of our history. So we have suddenly a concern about climate change, and now emissions rocket afterwards. Perhaps we've been better off if we'd never even thought about it. Probably not, but anyway. And it's still rising. There's no reason to think it's going to come down this year. It's gone up in 2021, and it looks like it'll probably go up again in 2022. That will depend a bit, of course, what happens with Ukraine, because that is really changing some attitudes towards energy use. So we've presided over 30-odd years of sort of failed policies and irresponsible sort of language and arguments that we've made around climate change. We haven't done what's necessary. We haven't reduced the emissions, and that's all, as I said before, that's all the physics cares about. What's our response to the climate emergency? So I spoke earlier about the emergencies that we had in terms of COVID and the banking crisis. We've seen no sweeping and rapid social change over climate change. Nothing like it at all. No immediate widespread penetration of low carbon technologies. What we've seen is more renewables plus more oil, coal and gas. And it's always, remember to think about the plus bit is really important. When you get people telling me we've got another 156 gigawatts of energy, of renewables that we come online by whatever it is, 2030, you know, that's pretty irrelevant if you burn more oil, coal and gas. The climate doesn't care about your renewables. It only cares about the molecules of CO2. It doesn't care about energy efficiency. It only cares about CO2 molecules. So being more efficient and having more renewables are irrelevant unless they actually substitute for the fossil fuels. And that's absolutely key here, because you regularly hear people talk about, oh, we're going to build this, that, and the other. But are you going to close the other things down? That's the bit that matters. So we've got more electric vehicles. We've also got more petrol and diesel cars as well, more sports utility vehicles. We've got improvements in efficiency, but we've got more consumption. And hence, if you put these things together, what you get is higher emissions. So what we've got as our response, though, is not a response that's actually based on the science, if you like, or informed by the science. But actually, we've got this sort of language now of net zero by 2045 for Sweden and indeed for Scotland, and net zero 2050 for the UK and some other parts of the world. So this whole sort of language of net zero, which I'm going to come back to later, is absolutely sort of central now to the discussions on climate change. And to me, it's another one of those ruses. It's another excuse for inaction, is this whole language of net zero, or not zero, as I think it should be more accurately called. And I want to ask, is that appropriate? Is net zero the appropriate response to our Paris temperature and equity commitments? Or is it just another way of disguising the problem? But we then get countries like Sweden, or indeed like the UK, saying, oh, but we're showing leadership. We're a country that's ahead of and Sweden's always making this claim. And coming from the UK on most things, I think Sweden's claims relative to the UK are appropriate. There are many positive things that Sweden does and has done historically that the UK only dreams of doing. When it comes to climate change, Sweden's not demonstrating positive change here. So if we look at the climate law and look what came out, I was talking to Isaac before, I think it was from the EPA, that in 2018, I'm sure you get the same sort of language today, that 27% reduction since 1990. But that ignores aviation and shipping, it ignores our imports and exports, and particularly aviation is a huge part of Sweden's carbon footprint. If you include those, you see no meaningful reduction since 1990. And that sounds different, doesn't it? That sounds like, here we are in Sweden, one of the most progressive countries in the world. We were involved in the IPCC report in 1990. We were there at Rio in 1992, and we've done absolutely nothing since. That's what one of the most progressive countries in the world has actually said. That's by its action. So you start to unpick it. You see this is true for country after country. Look at the UK. I mean, we're always full of rhetoric. We're sort of experts in rhetoric. So emissions in 2020, 51% lower than 1990 levels, 47% lower in in 1919. But again, include aviation shipping, no real leadership, 15% reduction since 1990. That's about 0.5% a year. But that's true for Denmark, for Sweden, for France, for the EU. Norway's emissions are up about 20-25%. Ireland's are up something similar. Belgium's are up as well, I think. So we see quite a lot of European countries have got higher emissions. The only reason the EU is roughly stable is because poor countries joined it. And because they were poor, they had less emissions, even though they were burning coal. So there is no good story from the EU, and it claims to be a progressive part of the world on climate change. Nothing like it. And of course, if we went over the pond to the US, that's even worse over there. So, if you look at Sweden's, going back to the comments made before about what the climate responds to, what's Sweden's response to this? Well, it's got its climate policy framework, and that does very well on some of those things I talked about. So Machiavellian policies, it's done very well on that. It's now, it evokes negative emission technologies. It's and I'll come back to these later. Future technologies that you, some of the younger ones here, and your children will have to deploy at planetary scale to remove my carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because I couldn't be bothered changing it, nor could the Swedish government today. So it's got Machiavellian policies, it's got eloquent arguments. Net zero by 2045. Oh, sorry, sorry, I should have. Machiavelli was well, he was probably a philosopher, or a political economist, I think. Would probably be, I don't know what you'd call him nowadays. And he wrote about statecraft. So about and writing about statecraft, it was about sort of saying one thing and doing another, trying to you're trying to keep people with you on board, but you really want to do this over here, which you know they don't support, and so you use language in a way that manipulates. It's well worth reading. I think it's called The Prince. It wasn't the only book he wrote, but it's really worth reading. It's quite a short book on statecraft, which was written a long time ago. But it captures a lot of the essence of our politics within countries and within companies as well, and I would argue globally. And worryingly, I think it also captures a lot of what we do in universities. So it's just being dishonest. And brutally, there's a degree of dishonesty in there. Eloquent arguments, net zero by 2045. Well, what's that mean? What's the net bit mean there? Why 2045? Legal niceties, you've got statutory requirements to provide annual reports on progress, so we'll report back on these things. And you've got accountancy scams, you're including offsetting, which is basically letting the poor parts of the world do the work for us. And Sweden has recently signed an agreement with Ghana, so it's going to pay Ghana to reduce its emissions. That means you haven't got to reduce them as much here. That's all sanctioned within the processes of the IPCC and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And Switzerland's got something similar. Sweden and Switzerland are asking poor parts of the world to cut their emissions additionally so they can carry on their high carbon lifestyles. It's obscene in my view. And of course, the climate doesn't care. So it only cares about the amount of CO2 molecules. And this falls far short of Sweden's temperature and equity commitments. Now, this is true for every other country as well, every other wealthy country. There's a few exceptions out there, but not in the wealthy part of the world that I'm aware of. So what does the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tell us about Paris? If there's anything that's not clear when I'm speaking, if I'm using acronyms or referring to organizations that you've not heard of, just ask, because I'm not sure what all your backgrounds are, but I thought most of you have done some. You've had quite a few courses, I think, on climate change, so you're probably familiar with it all anyway. So what does IPCC tell us? Well, if we look at the last three main reports, AR5, Assessment Report 5, SR 1.5, that was 2013 or 14, 2018, and then the one from last year, the physical basis of it anyway, from 2021. Then you can summarize them all, and I think Isaac Stoddard has given you a lecture on this already, but we've covered this. But it's this idea of carbon budgets, not long-term targets that matter. So it's if you're thinking about temperature in the future, what matters is the carbon budget, and I'll explain that in just a moment. So a carbon budget is, if you think of this this is just a schematic, so don't worry about the numbers. It's the area under the curve that matters. This is our emissions going up over time, and then it comes down. And usually we think about focusing on this bit under here. There's a bit over here like net zero by 2045. But the climate doesn't care about that. It cares about the amount of carbon dioxide, because the carbon dioxide accumulates year on year on year in the atmosphere. It doesn't go away. It stays there almost, it's not quite permanent, it's almost permanent. It's a very, very long lifetime. It's the same is true of nitrous oxide from agriculture, from fertilizer use, but less so for methane. But it has a very long lifetime, so it just builds up. So if in the short term you decide to expand an airport or build new roads or whatever it is you want to do and your emissions go up as a consequence, then it means that the future generations have to reduce their emissions even more. So you're passing that burden on to future generations. And I'll try and show later that's impossible. You're not going to be able to deliver that. So when we do these things today, effectively we're failing. Well, I'll show why that I think is the case later. So if we then go to AR6, that's the latest report from the IPCC, and they've provided us usefully with a table. I think it's 2.2 again. Oh, the same table number in the previous report actually, but table 2.2. It gives you a table of carbon budgets. You can have all these slides, and you can look at the tables in the IPCC, so you don't have to write them all down. But just to give a flavour of what these things are, what this table tells us is that if we want to aim at 1.5. Then, or 2 degrees centigrade, or 1.7 indeed here, then from 2020, and that's important to remember, from the beginning of 2020, it tells us how much carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere for a given probability, for a 50-50 chance of not exceeding 1.5. From 2020, we can pump in the atmosphere 500 billion tons, or 400 billion tons if you want a better chance of 1.5. Or 900 billion tons if you're happy with to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade. So there's quite a big difference in those numbers, depending on what probability you want. I'm going to focusing most here on the sort of 1.5, 50% chance of 1.5. So you then think, well, we're not in 2020, we're in 2022, and we're not in January 2022 now. We're in March. And so we have to really think about it every few months. We put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we take off roughly 80 billion tons. That's probably been a bit generous. It would have been a bit more than that if it wasn't for the COVID year, actually. Typically about 80 billion tons, 42 billion tons a year, there or thereabouts. About 36 to 37 billion tons from energy and industrial processes, and the rest of it from deforestation and from agriculture. And this is carbon dioxide only. So 420 billion tons. And we've got, I meant to change this. That's the wrong number. That should say 42. So I spotted this the other day and forgot to change it. So that should say 42. So we're emitting 42. So we have 10 years of current emissions. So for a 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, just 10 years of current emissions from the beginning of this year. And it's sort of realised, well, that's actually, that sounds quite a lot more severe than let's have net zero by 2045 for one of the richest countries in the world. You know, they're just not compatible. So now I want to sort of convert all that budget framework into what this means for us in terms of mitigation, in terms of cutting our emissions. So to limit to warming of 1.5, we've got this carbon pie or BULA, whatever you want to call it, which we know we've got 420 billion tons in there of CO2 that we can emit for every country in the world, including the poorer countries that are trying to grow and expand their economies and their societies, improve their societies. If you start to plot a pathway for a 50% chance of 1.5, you don't get a lot of choice. It looks something like that. This is just well, it's anthropogenic emissions of CO2. So it's just really from industrial processes, but from land use as well, how we've used agriculture, and particularly deforestation. So that adds about, the numbers are very variable on that, but 3 to 5 billion tons per year from that. So, but it doesn't include the other greenhouse gases. It doesn't include it. So the carbon budget is just for carbon, and to get those budgets, there's a set of assumptions about, well, what about the rest of the other greenhouse gases? So there are assumptions about that, about those that are embedded within the IPCC. But the majority of the warming is from the carbon dioxide anyway, about 80% of the warming. So you start to look at that. That's, jumped a bit fast then. That's very approximately zero emissions by about 2040 at a global level. But that only holds if you follow that pathway. If you don't follow the pathway, if it takes you a little bit longer to start coming down, then that date comes forward. And there's no neat way out of that. That goes back to those slides I showed before. And the reason it's so steep is because people like me and my generation have done nothing about it for 30 years. Well, we have done something about it. We've increased our emissions by 60%. So, the reason that we're now facing this is because of our choice to fail. But if you went to 67% chance, so a better chance of 1.5, and I think if you lived in Mozambique or Madagascar or Bangladesh, you'd be saying this is what we should be aiming for. But then look at that, that's zero emissions by 2035, just over 10 years from now at a global level. And if you go for 2 degrees centigrade, you get quite a big delay, so out to about 2055. So that gives you quite a lot longer to do something about it. But again, that's at the global level. But although they're the global emissions, we've actually committed to make our changes in accordance with equity, to take account of the poor parts of the world as well as the wealthy parts of the world and say, well, what are those differences? And if you've been looking at this, it's definitely worth, if you've not looked at it, it's definitely worth looking at the whole concept of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. It's a terrible expression, CBDR. It's locked into the UNFCCC back in 1992 and was actually was ratified in 1994. So it's worth looking into that, and that's the separation between the richer and the poorer parts of the world and how we should respond. So we've also bought into this at a global level and indeed nationally, and that means we have to separate the world into these two categories. I mean, obviously the world isn't separated into just the two, but basically the rich and the poor. But the poor includes China and it includes Rwanda. And obviously they're very different countries. But nevertheless, this is the language used in Paris. And it's still fair to say that even countries like China are still relatively poor countries. If you look at their income per capita, it's still very low compared with most of the Western countries. So it's still, I think, just about a fair categorization, but it's a bit too coarse. So some of the work that Jesse, Isaac, and I are doing now is expanding this, is going beyond these two categories. So what we have is, again, go back to that carbon pie before, you've got to take out from that the developing country parties, where about 83% or something of the world's population live, and this part where currently I think about 17% of the population live. How big is that slice? Now, it's just worth just looking at that. This is one for high chance. I happen to have these slides. I've used these ones here. 67% chance. So if you played out the pathways for those two, you would have something like this. For developed countries, remember that orange one is where most of the world's population live. And that's us here on this one. And that gives us something like a zero date for the wealthy parts of the world by about 2030. So you start to think, and so that's what I would think. If I lived in Mozambique, I would be asking that, or saying that that's what we should be doing 8 years from now to have zero fossil fuel use. If you go for an outside chance of 1.5, so there's only a 33% chance of it, so a much lower chance, you're much more likely to exceed it, then it doesn't expand much for the wealthy parts of the world. It goes out to about 2035, roughly, something like that, to be zero emissions. There's some reasons behind this, but basically what we try to do is, as we've got more carbon budget for the globe, for a lower chance of 1.5, we thought more of that should really go to the poorer countries than the wealthy countries. So the poor countries get a little bit longer to make that transition. But even when you look at the total emissions, if you like, it's sort of total emissions per person over the full time of the period out to 2035 compared to this one, we still get more than the poor parts of the world. So it's still not really fair when we look at this. So that's the sort of global picture split down to the developed and developing countries. And now I want to say, well, if we're not going to pass the buck on to future generations by relying on carbon dioxide removal, negative emission technologies, and other things like that, which I'll come back to later, or indeed saying let's require Ghana and other poor parts of the world to make the reductions for us. If we're not going to do that, what's Sweden's fair role in delivering on Paris? And this is coming from a paper that Isaac and I wrote a couple of years ago with one other colleague, John Broderick. So some of the numbers come from that. So, they build on that. If you look at the developed part of the world, we will then want to ask how much should Sweden get of that budget? And there are different ways to split this up. And the way that we split the budget up was in something called grandfathering, which is where we looked at the proportion of current emissions that come from Sweden relative to all of the emissions that come from the developing country parties, and say we should get that proportion of the budget. It's not a great way of doing it, but it's probably better than most of the other ones that are out there. So you can do it on the basis of population, You can make more complicated sort of calculations on the basis of your geography, whether you've got more access to hills for hydropower or not, and that sort of thing, or it's a windier country, so you can have more wind turbines. But in the end, we felt this process of grandfathering captured the broader range of issues. You could do it on the size of your economy and things like that as well. So, even when we've done this within countries, it still seems that grandfathering is a reasonable way to divide up the budget. It's not perfect, but it's the least worst of all the options that are there. And when we look at 1.5, and this is building on the work that Isaac and I did, but actually updating it to 1.5, notice that word provisionally. So we haven't actually published this anywhere. We've published the method for 2 degrees centigrade more so. That's that's the sort of range we have in Sweden. 100 to 150 million tons of carbon dioxide that we can dump out in the atmosphere from the start of this year out to pretty much forever. Now that might sound like quite a lot. That's 2 to 4 years of current Swedish emissions. Now this is territorial emissions. It includes aviation and shipping, but it doesn't include our imports and exports. So it's just what we do within the boundaries of Sweden, but includes our aviation and our shipping. So 2 to 4 years. And if you go out to 2 degrees centigrade, you get a bit longer. So you get longer than that. But whichever way you go, 2 or 4 there, it's a completely different world to what the Swedish government are talking about. So let's treat it like an emergency it is, or the emergency we claim it is. I have discussions with colleagues about this, whether emergency is actually the right language to use. I think we are in an emergency. I just think our responses aren't according to it, nothing like it. And there is a risk in responding to an emergency. You end up putting other measures in place that have other bad effects. So it's something you have to be very cautious about. But something like a 15 to 20% per annum reduction in emissions for 1.5. Now, if you want a better chance of 1.5, it gets well above 20%. That's every year, which just sounds huge. Imagine just doing that in our own lives. And I'll come back to that later because I'm going to touch on equity towards the end. So that would be sort of zero carbon transport and industry by about 2030-ish. That sort of time frame. 2035 is the very outside, but you're starting to come down immediately. And now I just want to compare that with Sweden's climate targets, which I gather is what this Swedish word means. Klimatmål, is that right, Isaac? Something like that, anyway, with a bad Swedish accent. So if you look at the sort of official version coming out, this is our best interpretation that Isaac and I could take from the legislation in Sweden, and compare that with our sort of analytical approach based on what the science is telling us with our own interpretations and some of the assumptions and so forth. The carbon budget that's been assumed in the Swedish legislation is somewhere between 700 and 850 billion tons, and we're putting it somewhere between 100 to 150 for 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's about 5% mitigation rate, something like that every year. We're talking about 15 to 20% every year. But if you actually follow that one through, the Swedish one at a sort of global level, it would be broadly 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of warming, as ours is aimed more at 1.5. But even if you went to the 2 degrees centigrade, which in fact the Swedish climate law was initially more focused on, I suppose, than the 1.5, though the 1.5 was still there when the law came out because it was embedded in Paris, but it wasn't as much of our sort of central target as it is today. Then we'd say our estimate would be about 200 to 300 billion tons, and about 12 to 15% per annum. So still way above this. I mean, these are different worlds to that. I mean, Sweden's not even really delivering this, not if you include aviation and shipping. Yeah, well, they haven't given a carbon budget analysis. So unlike the UK, where it's actually got, I don't like the carbon budgets that we have in the UK. I think they're completely unfair, and they're about as far away from what's necessary as are the Swedish ones. But the UK actually has the budgets written down. You can see the spreadsheet for every year going out to the future. Sweden doesn't have that. Sweden's framework is much looser. So Isaac and I had to interpret it from the sort of set years you've got. And so, I mean, that's actually in the paper about exactly that, yeah. I mean, it would be much more helpful if they said, and here's the spreadsheet that underpins it. But basically, although the Swedes were advised by the UK Committee on Climate Change that they should use a carbon budget approach, they came over here, there was quite a lot of discussion. The Swedish government didn't go ahead with that. And I think it's fair to say it's a much messier sort of legislative framework that you've got here than we have. Ours is much better defined. You can see all the numbers. I I mean, you can see all the scams that are going on in it as well. But the Swedish one is really loose, and it's still better than most other parts of the world, though. But it's rubbish. I think, would you say that's a fair assessment, Isaac? You looked a bit more detail than me. Okay. It's not as good as it could be. Yeah, yeah. Only that it was taken to court, wasn't it? It was taken to court, wasn't it? Wasn't there a court case? Yeah. I don't know about it in detail, because as is true for the Swedish one, I mean, it all also comes under the EU umbrella. And the EU are talking about putting in place carbon budgets that look to be very weak, but there are MEPs, including some Swedish ones, that are arguing that they should be much stronger. But I'm not aware of the Dutch one. The Dutch love numbers, from my experience of working with the Dutch before. So I'd rather hope they've got a more of a UK approach to the spreadsheet behind it all. But I don't know. Now the problem is, as soon as you use carbon budgets, it makes the situation much more difficult. And so there's a reluctance politically to use them, because they sort of tell you, well, this is what you've got to live within, and that implies things to your policies straight away, unless you use net, of course. That's the real trick. Yeah. Annoyingly, I haven't got the numbers in my head. Usually, I'm quite good at remembering the numbers, but we did do a presentation, didn't we, for the EU Commission? And I can't remember what number. The EU numbers were far too large for the EU. I mean, it's got a really small population. Global population, what, 7.8, 7.9 billion people? What's the EU running at? I'm just guessing somewhere about 400 to 450 million, so considerably less than half a billion. And it's taking 26 gigatons out of the budget that we've got globally. I mean, it's just completely disproportionate. Is that 27 we calculated the EU? Oh, was that the one for the talk recently with PAR in the? Okay, I'll have a look. We did the one for PAR recently. I'll have a look at that one. Yeah, yeah. I think that's not on there because that's a few years old. That one, I think, isn't it? Yeah. So now I can either carry on now, or we can have a break for 5 minutes. Which would you prefer? Right. I checked the EU numbers that we gave in the presentation, actually, Isaac, and it was 17 to 26 gigatons. So it was in that range. So it'd be interesting to look at the article in I'm going to butcher it, Dagas Newton, whatever it's called. Yeah. Because I know that the Swedish MEP, Per Holmgren, is it, Alice? Is it Isaac? Yeah, that he's been pushing for a stronger one within the EU. So I'm interested if the article had some relationship to what he thought was necessary, because it's him that we've engaged with in the EU. But anyway, you can ask him, because he's coming to give a lecture here, I think, at the end of the month. I think on the 28th or 29th of March, I think. Right, I'm just going to do a little bit now and say why is what I'm showing here so different to what we traditionally get to hear, which certainly from a UK perspective is around net zero by 2050, Scotland net zero by 2045, and I think Sweden net zero by 2045. So why is it different? Well, firstly, let's remember that, I mean, I don't know if you use the language of net zero when you talk about these things, but it's new. It's just almost come out of nowhere very rapidly. So if you go back to the IPCC SR 1.5, I haven't done this for the latest AR6 report, but SR 1.5, in the summary for policymakers, it's mentioned 16 times. If you look at it in the AR5 report, it's not mentioned once. Now, I think you'll probably find it's mentioned hundreds of times in the latest AR6 report. Literally, I think it'll be hundreds. I don't know. I've not checked that. That's my guess. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK, which is probably the place that coined this expression that's quickly spread around the world. If you look at the 6th carbon budget report, so its main report that it gives to government and what we need to do, that came out in 2020. I didn't count it all, but it's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 times it's referred to. If you look at the 5th carbon budget report that came out in 2015, it's not referred to once. So as soon as this expression came out, everyone jumped on it, because anything can fit in net zero. So to me, it's an incredibly dangerous phrase. It sort of has some legitimacy in the sort of, if you're just talking about the science, that you have to have zero emissions or net zero emissions of all the greenhouse gases. But when you start to convert that into the policy realm, I think it's a really dangerous way of looking at these things. And I think it's been done deliberately because it allows you to play out an easier story. Net zero, firstly, it's very seldom based on a total global carbon budget. It's just some sort of date We're not in my term of office, as I refer to it normally. In other words, the policymakers will be dead or retired by the time the zero date comes along. It focuses on far-off endpoints, not carbon budgets. It typically substitutes, and this is its great skill, is it allows you to substitute all sorts of things in a really dangerous way. It allows you to substitute between different greenhouse gases. It allows you to swap carbon dioxide for methane. They're not the same thing. They have different chemistries in the atmosphere, different lifetimes in the atmosphere, different levels of certainty, different sources. They're just not interchangeable, but they are if you want to make sure that you minimize your policy effort. Different sources. So you can exchange carbon dioxide from cars with nitrous oxide from fertilizer. You know, these are completely different, with very different chemistries and different atmospheric residence times. And hugely different levels of certainty. You can substitute across time. So you can say that it's okay, we can emit carbon dioxide from a flight today, because it's okay that in years to come, we're going to capture the carbon dioxide in 2070 from some trees. That's perfectly legitimate to do in this process. And if you look at the spreadsheets underpinning some of the policies, that's actually there. It assumes a ton is a ton of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, regardless of their atmospheric chemistries, the very different chemistries they have, particularly some of the more exotic greenhouse gases. Their atmospheric lifetimes, they vary hugely. You know, methane somewhere between 10 and 20 years. You know, nitrous oxide, I think it's near 300 years. Carbon dioxide, depends how you look at it, but very, very long. I mean, people used to say 100 years, but 20% of the carbon dioxide lasts for maybe 10 to 20,000 years. So in a sense, it's almost permanent. And huge levels of different levels of certainty and risk. If I buy a flight ticket today and jump on a plane and fly somewhere, guaranteed to emit carbon dioxide, I can't assume that someone's going to change their pig husbandry in China in 2030. You know, that's got a massive uncertainty. And yet net zero allows us to make those substitutions across time, across gases, across sources. It's a really dangerous way of looking at this. But it doesn't mean you can minimize your effort in wealthy countries particularly. Yeah, and that's one of the risk issues. So that means, for those who are unaware, that roughly half of the emissions we put in the atmosphere are absorbed by the oceans. Now, when you have a stable, when you don't have ongoing emissions, or you just have the normal natural level of emissions, everything's at equilibrium. But because we've come along and we've completely changed the equilibrium, at the moment what's happening is the oceans are absorbing half of the carbon dioxide they've put in the atmosphere, which is good. Because if they stop doing that, then the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere goes up very quickly of carbon dioxide, and you get a rapid level of warming. And this, what's called the airborne fraction, this amount that's absorbed by the oceans, is thought that it's going to go down. The oceans will absorb less as the temperature warms. Now, there's some evidence that some oceans are already starting to do that. And they're doing it for quite complicated reasons. So I think it's around one of the seas around the Antarctic, I think it's doing this. And it's because of the way the windfall patterns have changed. This is my understanding anyway. The windfall patterns have changed off the Antarctic because of the changes of the temperature. And that's meant the sea is not as choppy. The wind, it's not as wavy, if you like. And then that changes the surface area, and that changes the amount of CO2 you can absorb. So there's some sort of sense that we're starting to see some of these changes already, where the oceans are not absorbing as much carbon dioxide. But overall, at the moment, they still look like they're absorbing roughly the same as they were. But there's a belief that the science suggests that they will absorb less as the temperature warms. And there's a simple bit of physics that as the temperature of oceans warm, they can't hold as much carbon dioxide. It's just a partial pressure thing. It is, I mean, you're absolutely spot on there. You haven't got to close down your industries, but the industries would have to find alternative forms of zero carbon energy. And that will probably mean in the short term, and maybe in the long term, in my view, that we have to produce much less, certainly in the wealthy parts of the world. So it says something about consumption. But then, of course, that is starting to question the concepts of economic growth. And you can question the laws of physics, but you can't question the ephemeral law of economic growth, it would appear. But I think you're right about that. So this other thing that we use is negative emission technologies, carbon dioxide removal. Sorry, the overall language is carbon dioxide removal. That's what's typically used now. They change these terms every few years, but that's what's popular now. CDR. And it includes two things. One's negative emission technologies, and the other one's nature-based solutions, so-called nature-based solutions. And I don't know if maybe you've had lectures on these, I'm not sure, but you had lectures on nets. So they're just ways, technologies that will find to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are some very small pilot schemes around the world on these, but they're incredibly small. So far, the amount of CO2 we've absorbed by these technologies is about 0.0018% of our emissions each year. So we're not doing too well on it. And the estimates for how much we'll absorb by about 2030 take it to somewhere around about 0.02% of our current emissions. So these things are fine, but they're not played out in any scale yet, and they may never be able to be. But we rely on them on the models because it allows us to carry on, as you were saying before, carry on sort of business as usual. And nature-based solutions are things like planting trees and changing some crops that we might buy, but that might grow. But nature-based solutions are incredibly dangerous as well because they're typically assumed very simply in the models not to, say, affect the soil. So if you plant trees in certain places, you mobilize the carbon that's locked in the soil. There's more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere. So if you start to change how the soils operate, which we know will happen as the temperature warms, but also if you're planting things in the wrong places, you get these effects. So there's no permanence with nature-based solutions. But when you release the CO2 from the fossil fuels that have been locked up for millions of years, there is a permanence in that. You put it in the atmosphere, definitely. But you're not definitely locking it up when you grow trees. So you've got to be really careful about these, what look like really simple solutions. There's a lot of complicated things with nature-based solutions. And in fact, people who work on them broadly say you should not substitute them for fossil fuels. They're not the same thing. And just to give a sort of sense of the scale, that they're typically, in most of the models in the IPCC, Working Group 3 on mitigation in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not the Working Group 1, which is the science part, but Working Group 3, which is the politics and well, in my view, the fairy tale side of it. They all, virtually all, well, I think all the main scenarios assume hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal. Most of them assume negative emission technologies, and some assume, well, one particular assumes more nature-based solutions. But they postulate that this will happen. Remember, there are no scenarios in the IPCC, none of their main scenarios do not include these at huge levels. Every single scenario includes them at huge levels. And so there's no, well, let's just do 10% of our models like this. No, we have it everywhere. And that's because they've got to maintain the sort of economic balance that we currently have, or imbalance. It's also interesting that most of this negative emissions occurs later in the century. Again, as I said before, when the modelers are dead, when the politicians are dead, and when all the other people that say it's a good idea are dead. So I think there's a real issue there that we're passing that burden on to future generations. It's similar in scale to the current global oil and gas industry. So the models virtually all assume an industry that does not exist today will exist in every scenario in the future, roughly the same size as the current oil and gas industry. Nowhere else would you ever think that's a reasonable thing to do. But the problem here is without it, the implications are huge. As I say, these technologies are at best at small pilot scale. Now, there's no big versions of these out in the world anywhere. My position on carbon dioxide removal is that, yes, we should pursue it. We should fund a major research and development program. In fact, it's getting lots of funding now. We're doing lots of funding on this, but very little funding on radical social change. But it should be funded, including nature-based solutions and nets. And I'm quite happy to have them deployed if they meet stringent sustainability criteria. And that includes social criteria as well as ecological criteria. So you've really got to think, what are the social and ecological impacts of these things? And only if they meet those should we be deploying them. A paper that I wrote with a colleague, Glenn Peters, a few years ago, we referred to, I think it was, if you use the level of BECCS, which is one of the technologies assumed in the models, then its effect on land use and biodiversity was the same as 2.8 degrees centigrade of warming. So to solve the warming, you end up doing something else, which affects how we use land, and the effects of that on biodiversity were as bad as 2.8 degrees centigrade of warming. So in fact, if you like, the cure was worse than the disease. And the argument I would say for me is that we should actually reduce our emissions today, mitigate today, and assume CDR doesn't work at scale. So yeah, let's do some research on it, but let's just pretend it doesn't work, because at the moment it doesn't work, and maybe it will do in the future. So that's the position I hold on that. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we're going to need some sort of ways of compensating for the warming from agriculture. We cannot eliminate all of the greenhouse gases from agriculture. There's going to be a huge quantity of nitrous oxide and methane. Even if we all went vegan and we had no-till, no ploughing policies on agriculture, which you couldn't use everywhere, if we did everything we possibly could, the estimates are still pretty high for emissions from agriculture. WRI estimate 4 billion tonnes a year. There's a paper came out a few years ago was estimating 7 tonnes. Some people think it might be nearer 10. So it's still a lot of emissions of nitrous oxide and methane, and you cannot eliminate those. And so those ones, actually, we will have to find some way of compensating for them. But that does mean that our energy emissions have to be zero. There's no option but to have zero emissions from energy. Some argue that net zero is a policy framework for all, and that actually is the real strength of net zero. Everyone can buy into it. To me, that's its weakness, is that everyone can buy into it. And so that's, I think, what other people think is its strength. Actually, I see that very much, that sort of vagueness of what it is, and the way that it sort of undermines the need for deep emission cuts today, I think is absolutely key. If we look at net zero in the UK, because we've got nice spreadsheets we can go and analyse, it's still assumed, they call it net zero 2050. In 2050, it's still emitting 31 million tonnes of CO2 from fossil fuels. Now that's about heading towards 3/4 of Sweden's current territorial emissions. And we're still emitting that from burning fossil fuels in 2050. I mean, just to put that in some sort of context, in 2050, the UK emissions per person will be higher than a typical Kenyan has emissions today. In 2050. Yes, this doesn't fit with the science at all. It also assumes that we will carry on emitting well after 2050 out to the rest of the century, but it doesn't give us any data on that. But if you make some reasoned and quite conservative assumptions, that's about another 500 million tonnes of CO2 just from the UK after 2050 from burning fossil fuels. So net zero allows this to happen, which means that our policies today don't have to be so severe. And it requires, of course, huge amounts of negative emission technologies. So it's pretty much in the sort of middle estimate of the IPCC scenarios of how much of that they assume will work. And put simply, in my view, net zero allows large but still incremental change to business as usual, and that's its purpose. The reason we have net zero is because we are not prepared to question the industrial processes we have today. We're not prepared to question the concept of economic growth. All of that is beyond question, and therefore we have to try everything else we can to hold that myth together. And Isaac and I just had a piece published just a couple of days ago in just a blog piece in Climate Home, and we made this comment right as opening it. Just remember what net zero is about, really. The UK government has just approved new North Sea oil fields and presiding over airport expansion. The EU has ignored the climate science, embraces gas as a transition fuel, which it still uses that language, and sees sports utility vehicles soar. So they're those big SUV things, four-wheel drives, that sort of thing. They've got the highest sales of those in the last year in the record of the EU. It's never sold so many as last year. But then if you go across the Atlantic, you've got Biden claiming about all the wonderful things about climate change, spending 25 billion of federal money on new airports, or expanding airports actually, and saw a 6% rise in its CO2 emissions in 2021. Yeah, so make the comment here, 3 months on from COP26, with declarations of climate emergencies now de rigueur, so now everywhere, and Exxon and Saudi Arabia also have net zero promises now. Their emissions are again set to rise in 2022. So everyone's got these net zero promises, and yet emissions are set to still rise in 2022. It just paints out the lie that is net zero. But virtually no one, well, very, very few of the orthodox people working on climate change, or the well-established ones, would agree with me on this. They all think it's a wonderful thing, most of them privately. So, but you can't just bin it. You have to, what's the alternative? To me, the alternative is quite straightforward and quite simple. And use a carbon budget framing, and that tells you roughly, for say 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, and that tells you then roughly how much energy, how much carbon dioxide you can emit from energy, and it tells you roughly by 2035 for developed nations you have to be zero emissions. But it gives you an accurate budget for them, or a good, robust budget to work with. Separate to that, I would say we want also a carbon dioxide emissions target for industrial processes. That's the chemical processes that make cement and steel and things like that. So have that again, but and I'll come back to the important difference between these two in a moment. Separate target again for the other greenhouse gases, for methane and nitrous oxides from agriculture. And you could separate out the gases as well, because they have very different chemistries. So there might be some important part in that. And based on a consumption basis there as well. So because we import and export a lot of food. So I think you have to do it from a consumption basis. And separate targets for these negative emission technologies and nature-based solutions. But the absolute key difference between all those other things is no substitution. You cannot substitute negative emissions in 2050 for cutting back on car travel today. There's no substitution between those. I think these things should be completely separate, and each sector has to deal with that, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy, whether it's industrial processes. You have your target, and you can't try and massage it. You can't try and use Machiavellian policies to move it between sectors, which is what is currently happening. And that's what net zero is all about. It's not about reducing emissions, it's about moving emissions. So I'm just going to touch on just the equity issue, which I don't know if you've had slides on this before, but just these are old slides, but the same argument still holds. CO2 is emissions are highly skewed. Yeah, but I mean that's a real problem with that mechanism. I don't think that should be allowed at all. So I would have no substitution between countries. So I think the substitution is the huge challenge in climate change. That is why we keep failing, because we're never prepared to sort of face up to the harshness of what we have to do. We always find some way to substitute the problem, to pass it to somewhere else. And I say Sweden has just signed an agreement under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the Paris Agreement, UNFCCC? I can't remember, but Article 6, is it? Do you know which one it is, Isaac? Is it UNFCCC or is it Paris? The Article 6. Anyway, it's Paris. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows for these substitutions. And Sweden has just signed an agreement with Ghana so that it will pay Ghana to reduce its emissions, to allow Sweden to carry on, like you were saying. That's the clean development mechanism locked into the Paris Agreement. So it's a mistake. We can't do that. Yeah, I think the carbon budget approach, broken down to nations, and then nations can't substitute to another nation, is how it should be. Substitution should be stopped at every single level. That is the big problem, as I see it anyway. So on the equity part, you might have seen this curve before. So it's taken from Oxfam, but it's based on the Chancellor and Piketty report from 2015, actually. But it still holds today, and Stephen Carter has done some work on this recently. It just shows how the emissions are massively skewed to relatively small groups of the population. So to put it in simpler forms, half of all of carbon dioxide emissions come from 10% of the population. And about 2/3 of that group, I think, are in the OECD countries, and 1/3 is in the poorer countries. 17% of the emissions come from 20% of the population. And I think the most damning figure to come out of the report last year from Stephen Carter, and it's been verified by the people doing the same work, is the top 1% of emitters have lifestyles that emit twice as much carbon dioxide as the bottom half of the world's population. So, that is a really obscene figure, really. We've been talking about climate change since 1990, and that today we have a position where the top 1% have lifestyles that have twice the emissions of the bottom half of the world's population. That is a really damning stat, I think. It shows how little we care about climate change, or indeed other people, let alone our own children. Does this really matter? This is a calculation I've been using for years, and it still holds. I checked it again for this talk. If we were serious about climate change and we thought it was an existential threat, that's an old language, I shouldn't use that, but you think it is a climate emergency we should respond to, and you had regulations around the world that forced that top 10% to reduce their carbon emissions, their carbon footprint, to the level of the average European. So that's not a European Union citizen. That's not that low. I think it's around about 7 tons per person. So if we did that, and the other 90% of the world's population just carried on emitting exactly as they are today, didn't go up, didn't go down, just the same, that alone would be a 1/3 cut in global emissions. Now that's way ahead of anyone's talking about. Now if it's an emergency, you can do that in a year. You could probably do it in a month if it was an emergency. But we're not doing anything like this. We're not prepared to ask issues of equity. We're not prepared for the rich countries to make the rapid changes that are necessary. So at every level, we undermine this. Equity is almost never talked about within countries. It's not talked about much between countries, but never within a country. If you look at countries like the US or the UK, that's hugely important. So just to bring this to an end, Sweden's current approach on climate change, in my view, has a vague carbon pathway. It's not got a carbon budgeting framework. I mean, the UK does have that. I mean, that's much more precise than this. I suppose, but it's still inadequate. In effect, the Swedish approach says we prefer astrology to science and logic, which I think is quite damning. It should be based on the science and the logic related to the commitments that we've made politically. Remember, this starts from the political position. It doesn't start from the science, it starts from the politics and the social science side, if you like. It's characterized by delusion, by inequality. It's deeply colonial. I'm saying that as a British person whose whole history is based on, or at least the history in the last few hundred years is based on a colonial approach. It's short-term politics and reliance on technology as tomorrow. That's what the Swedish approach is based on. And this is, say, true for most others. And I think there's a real callous disregard for its own children. The policymakers today, when you've got an election coming up this year, just listen to what they've got to say. They really are saying, we do not care about our own children. Either that or they're saying they don't believe in climate science, or the science underpinning climate change. You can't have it both ways. If you think the science underpinning climate change is broadly right, and you care about your children, you have to put policies in place to do something about it. But I don't think you'll be seeing that. I hope to be wrong. Maybe you'll have a really good election with climate change an important issue. Disturbingly, Sweden and the UK are actually the more developed, in terms of their policies, have more developed mitigation strategies than most other wealthy, high-emitting nations. It's not. Sweden is terrible, but it's just it's still probably slightly better than the other terrible ones in the box as well. The headline choice for Sweden is you can continue to ignore international equity, pass a huge burden onto our children, be part of a 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade future, renege on our Paris commitments. But that very nicely dovetails with today's politics. It maintains the current economic market model. And that means you can have net zero by whenever you want at some point in the future, 5% per annum reduction rates. And it's all lovely and so forth. And I hope your children will forgive you. But if Sweden's preference is to take international equity seriously, to have a huge commitment in reducing our emissions by this generation, by us today, to cut emissions in line with 1.5, and to abide by our own Paris commitments, then that means a huge ramp up in government leadership, a reshaping of mainstream economics, which I think has happened anyway since the banking crisis, and then with equity. But here also with equity at its core, you can't ignore the equity part. You cannot squeeze emission reductions out of people that hardly emit. You've got to get the emission reductions out of those of us who are responsible for most of the emissions. And that's a 15 to 20% reduction in emissions per year. And that's across everything. That's across real zero in transport, industry, and so forth by about 2030, 2035 at the outside. So a very different picture. Living on Paris and on G7 requires us to question what constitutes growth, progress, and development. So we're now to ask fundamental questions about the world in which we live because we haven't done anything for 30 years. We have to reframe our concept of values and success. Remember, when we think what success means in our society, it means you have a higher carbon footprint. That's what we all aim to do. We're all looking to get more money, which always, at the moment, always goes with a higher carbon footprint. Look at the people who we see as successful. They always have massive carbon footprints. So reframe what is important in our society. Actually, COVID should tell us a lot about that anyway. An alternative relationship with time. We need to learn lessons from history, and we need to think about the future rather than just think about today. And the current economic framework is much more locked into the short term. And I think that's locked into many of our psychologies now because of that. Embed intra and intergenerational equity in ways that genuinely embed it, not just a lip service, and a much more deeper appreciation of the modern human world. And it's one that we all struggle with. It's one that I still struggle with a lot, actually, but that as well. In 2022, climate change has become system change. I'm going to pinch this from Einstein, at least it's attributed to him, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we've chosen to pass on to our own children the consequences of 30 years of such insanity. And in my view, you can't quite hear it, net zero is the latest incarnation of that same insanity. So on that upbeat note, I do have some upbeat slides as well, but I haven't included them. They're actually, I've got them at the end. I could show them. But yeah, thanks for listening. You've got any, And happy to have any questions, disagreements. Yeah. But there is a lot of talk about this, and it's getting more than talk. So first, the first part about growth, there's a lot more people now engaged in discussions of degrowth and of post-growth, and it's quite well advanced. So it's not as if they're just using it in some sort of general form. They're talking about Where does the degrowth come from? How would you bring it about? What about the poor parts in community who still need to grow their emissions and grow their quality of life, improve their quality of life? So there's quite a lot of discussions in that. There's lots and lots in the academic literature. But even within the EU, they've had discussions on economic growth now, on degrowth as well. So that discussion is being had more widely. And actually, in some ways, it's quite interesting that since the banking crisis, so for over 10 years now, many people in the wealthy parts of the world, in the US, in the UK, in Italy, in Spain, I don't know about the Scandinavian countries, but a lot of people in those countries haven't experienced any economic growth for over 10 years. Now, the wealthy ones have experienced huge economic growth. The wealthy have done incredibly well during COVID as well. But the poorer communities in these societies have not experienced growth for long periods of time. So I think it's not as if we're all experiencing this. Even within wealthy countries, large swathes of our society have not experienced economic growth. So it's not as if it's something we can't talk about because it's actually happened. So I think we have to have that dialogue that is occurring, and the more of us that talk about it and think about it, then the better that is, and engage with our policymakers about it as well. But the second one, well, could you use some sort of taxation process? You can, and that's actually quite a lot of economists like this idea of some sort of taxation, and that would be a sort of fairer way of doing it. In my view, it's a problem because if you put a tax on things and you're not very well off, then who are the people who are most going to be affected? If you want to heat your home and you're struggling to heat your home and now the price of gas is higher, then you can't heat your home so much. But the wealthy person can carry on just as before. They can afford it. So unless there's some way to ensure that the wealthy are high emitters are most hit by that, then it becomes very unfair. And there are arguments around that. So there's something called fee and dividend, which people have talked about, whereby you have you build up to a very high carbon tax, and then the money is handed back to most of the population, equal per capita. And that way, the argument there is that the poorer get a lot more money back than the cost of the extra carbon tax, but the wealthy have to pay loads more carbon tax. And that at least initially, sounds quite appealing. I don't think you could do it at a global level. I think it'd be impossible, but I think you could do it at a national level, some sort of taxation. Ultimately, you've got to find a way of rationing. That's what we're talking about, is rationing. You've got to live within the carbon budget. How are you best appropriate to ration? Are you best appropriate on issues of quantity and what we need to lead a reasonable life, or on the basis of price, which is what a carbon tax is? So there are pros and cons to it, but I think the equity part has to be thought about really carefully. Yeah. Well, I would recommend reading some of the work by Julius Steinberger and by Will Lamb. They looked at this argument about sufficiency, which is really what you're talking about here. So there's definitely stuff out there to look at that's really interesting in this. Yeah, I think that's a serious issue, particularly about 1.5, because 1.5, it's always hard to know exactly what the temperature difference is now to the pre-industrial period. I mean, we've got a pretty good handle on it, but things like in fact, the last IPCC report, SR 1.5, didn't deal with this very well. The way that they looked at the temperature, as I understand it, it ignored some of the issues about the Arctic, where there were very few measuring stations. But we know the Arctic had warmed a lot more. So when you looked at the global average, it wasn't really taking the Arctic properly into account. And so when they did that, it went more like to 1.1. So I think there's a sort of wide acceptance we're probably at 1.1-ish and going up. And that 2035 is probably when we're going to hit, doesn't mean that particular year, but that sort of period, 2035 to 2040, we'll be at 1.5. We'll probably hit 1.5 before that, and then it'll drop again, because it's never perfect. If you look at the curve goes like this, but it's got noise on it. And so we will probably hit 1.5 before then. I think that's an issue. What happens when we hit 1.5? And it's not as if when you hit 1.5, all hell breaks loose. All hell will be breaking loose in some parts of the world. It's happening now at 1.1. So, I mean, there is an issue about this temperature thresholds that they sound like it's a threshold when you go over a cliff, but there isn't a cliff that you go over that we know of. It might be there's some tipping points out there that are really important, or non-linearities, but we don't know exactly where they are. But there is an issue with these things. At the end of the day, they're a proxy for the rate of change of impacts. That's what really matters to it. It's not about the impacts, but how fast do they change? Because we can live with impacts if they change over 1,000 years, but if they change in 10 years, you can't. And so it's the rate of change of impacts, and the temperature is just a proxy for that. In some ways, a good proxy. I think if we were starting again now, we wouldn't use it. It's probably not been a very helpful proxy. But once it's locked into it, then it's quite hard to get out of it now. But I think when we hit 1.5, I think it'd be interesting to see interesting and disturbing to see how we respond to it. Well, remember that a lot of the wealthy countries were going up until the banking crisis, which was not a climate change policy. The banking crisis and COVID both were effective climate change policies because they affect the economy. So if you look at a lot of the wealthy countries, their emissions were still going up. So we were part of that 60% rise, but the banking crisis and actually some shift in our energy system, particularly away from coal, has made quite a big difference. So the UK, it's almost everything in the UK is down to the move away from coal. And that move away from coal was mostly not driven by climate change. It's partly driven by climate change. It was driven by a whole set of other reasons, to do with sulfur and also to do with the politics of the unions that ran the mines. But obviously the biggest driver are the biggest emitters, and the biggest emitters are the US and China. But it's very easy to pick on both of those. I mean, we're all part of this story. So the China is always picked on now, even more than the US, because it's the biggest emitter. But its emissions per capita are still very low, and they make a lot of our products. They make this computer, they make probably this headphone set, they probably make this remote control. I don't think they made this, but maybe they did. They probably made. I try to avoid Chinese make, but I don't know. Maybe clothes I'm wearing are Chinese. I don't know. But we can't just think about blaming China, and that's a language that is repeatedly used, and particularly in the US. But their emissions per capita are still much lower than lower than ours from a consumption base anyway. But so China and the US are the biggest ones, but I think we're all part of that story. Yeah, I think the issues in Africa are hugely challenging. It's much more challenging than the Chinese ones because I mean, you look at a lot of the African countries, they have really low emissions and much lower quality of life than say China or Indonesia. And that is a real challenge because their emissions, most of those countries want their emissions to rise. I think we're coming towards the end. Just quickly, this is from a website called the Global Carbon Atlas, and it's based on some work by an organization called the Global Carbon Project. And you can tap in your countries here, and you can look at a number of things on it. So it's really useful to be able to sort of, you can see sort of China's emissions, the dark one here. So you can see China's emissions going up there. But you can just tap away any country you want. So you can take all these ones out, and you can go in here and you can look at it per capita. You can look at it in lots of different ways. You can put in, I don't know whether they call it Holland or the Netherlands. I don't know what they call it. They don't call it Holland. They call it Netherlands. Yeah, Netherlands, there you go. You can plug in the Netherlands and you can look at this is their actual sort of territorial emissions, so the emissions from just within their boundaries. So you can see what's happened to their emissions over the years. And then you can also then ask it, well, let's take consumption into account. So our imports and exports, and you get some idea what that's like. So you can do that for country after country. So it's got a really useful website to sort of get a handle on what's going on there. This is just carbon dioxide emissions. It doesn't include aviation and shipping, which is really important. So unfortunately, when you look at this data, it excludes aviation and shipping emissions, which is a bit annoying. Well, that happened after the breakdown of the Soviet Union the first time. Their emissions absolutely plummeted. I mean, they were very, very poor as a consequence, of course. But it's just a useful website to be aware that it's there. It's free access. It has lots of other information as well. And you can download the spreadsheets. If you actually want all the data, you can actually download the spreadsheets as well as just this. So we use it. Jesse, Isaac, and I use it, and other colleagues a lot. It's a very reliable, robust source. It's not the only one that's out there. There are other good ones as well, but it's well worth looking at. Territorial emissions are emissions that you release within your boundaries. So basically, in this case, this is almost all fossil fuel. But so the fossil fuels you burn within the boundaries of Sweden or the boundaries of the Netherlands. So it doesn't include the fossil fuels that are used to make the products that you buy or sell. So if you've got an industry in the Netherlands and then you sell all those products to the UK, well, the emissions then still are in the Netherlands. If you use a consumption-based account, then it tries to do some way of balancing those. And it does that, actually, going back to what General said behind you before. It actually looks at it from a dollar point of view. What are the emissions per sort of dollar? So it's an input-output analysis based on exchange values and what we think is actually locked into those things. It's very, very rough, very coarse. It's better than nothing, but it's nowhere near as reliable as the territorial data, which just measures the amount of fossil fuels you use. So it's much more reliable. But it misses this hugely important part of our big carbon footprint, which for some parts of the world is very, very, is a key part of that.
We should wrap up. It's 12:05, but maybe you're hanging around a couple of minutes, Kevin, as well, if there's any additional questions. And thank you again. We should do a round of applause.
Thank you.